and hopefully this will all work out well. And
It
then,
says recording.
yes, it does. So this will be my first one, and then we'll figure out what to do with the recording after this. But anyway, so let's start with Deuteronomy chapter 7. But before we start, we've been in Deuteronomy for, I don't know, 3 weeks now, and so I just wanted to see if there are any questions or just ideas that have been percolating, because we haven't been really able to do this. So I wanted to just take a moment to see if anybody had questions or just musings about Deuteronomy. Anything? Yesterday, we actually, and if you listen to the sermon or were here last night, we spent a lot, sometime, not actually in Leviticus, but just talking about the clean versus unclean stuff in Leviticus, which will certainly play into Deuteronomy. This coming week, we're going to be talking about, on Sunday, we're going to be talking about worship, and how that works out. And so that will also in some ways draw from Leviticus too. So remember Deuteronomy, or not Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, what's usually called the Torah, right, is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you look at, remember, there are 5 books. If you look at how the first 5 books are organized, Leviticus is actually the center point, and particularly Leviticus 16, which is the Day of Atonement. Of all 5 of those books, that's kind of the central theme, is the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. And so all of the Pentateuch has at its core, if God is really present with us, if he is our God and he's our God, we're his people, and he will dwell in our midst, what would that mean for life if God really is actually dwelling in your midst? And so that's kind of the question that is answered by really the whole Pentateuch, the whole first 5 books, but also when you get to how that all plays out in the in the history, and then the prophets go, well, you didn't live as if God was dwelling in your midst, and this is what happens. And so the real question is, that the Bible really talks about, is the presence of God. And of course then you get to the New Testament, and that same idea goes through, right, goes through through that. So Deuteronomy is going to continue that, and it's going to say you can, you choose life or death, but remember, God's in your midst, so your choices have ramifications in that. So I thought we would remember, chapter 6 is about loving love God with all your heart and your soul and your mind and strength. Pass these things along to your children, make sure they know to do that. Now, then in chapter 5, we did the 10 Commandments, I think last week or 2 weeks ago. I can't remember now. We did the 10 Commandments. And so the book of Deuteronomy can be organized sort of based on the 10 Commandments. So remember, in chapter 5, he gives the 10 Commandments. In chapter 6, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, which would correspond to Commandment 1. And then the rest of them. So the first chapters, I don't know the exact breakdown, we'd have to look at it, but the first chapters after that deal with remember, the first 3 commandments are about God. The 4th commandment, love your keep the Sabbath, kind of moves from God into the sort of how we deal with humans, and then the rest of it deals with how we deal with others. So and Deuteronomy follows that structure, where you see, I think it's 6 through 11 primarily deal with worship and how we deal with God. There is a holy time, there's this idea, and then after you move out of that, there's there's the ideas of generosity and justice, and all of those things, which would correspond to the last half of the 10 Commandments. So Deuteronomy is kind of laid out in a sense of, here's the 10 Commandments. Now let's talk about how we apply the 10 Commandments. And you can see it moving in that direction. So once you have that structure in mind, you kind of begin to make sense and go, okay, I'm kind of in, the first commandment now, or I'm in the second commandment, or I'm all the way down in the seventh commandment, depending on how you go, where you are in the book of Deuteronomy. It's at least sort of like that. But I thought I'd start us off on our hardest one by thinking about, remember, we just were told to love God with all of our heart. Now we're going to be told to be holy and separate. But I kind of skipped over, I don't know if you've read yesterday, you realize I skipped over something really important. And so it's, I skipped that. We started in verse 5 of 7, and I purposefully skipped over because the sermon would have been difficult to fit all of it in. But it says this. So if you want to turn to Deuteronomy 7, he says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you the many nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites, and stalactites and stalagmites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, and do not give your daughters and sons or take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. Now, this is where we picked up in the sermon, right? This is what you are to do. Break down the altars, smash the sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. So you notice I conspicuously skipped over 1 through 4, and we just started in 5. And the reason being is because I just didn't want to have to, in the sermon, deal with the whole idea of the destruction and all that. So I'm just curious, as you've been reading through Deuteronomy, this is one of those parts that is it's always troubling, and it's been troubling to everybody. And you can even see it's actually even troubling to the Old Testament itself. And I'll talk about that later. But I was just curious about what you guys are thinking about when you read any parts of this, either in Deuteronomy or Joshua, which is mostly where we get those. Any thoughts or?
No, I think he's trying to say to not, assimilate yourself with the culture. I'm not sure that God is ordering them to go to war and, riot and whatever. But it is, I think he's just trying to say, don't adopt the culture around you. Keep separate.
That is part of it. But he does say, destroy them completely, show them no mercy. I'm actually sending you in there to do that. I mean, it is in there. It's now one of the reasons why they are to be destroyed completely is so that there's no remnant left to influence that. I mean, that's one of the reasons, is that there's nobody there to influence them and to draw them away from worshiping the one true God, Yahweh. Of course, we see, here's the thing, the Bible, what says here actually never takes place. They never utterly destroy everybody.
Well, I think that's what I was
trying
to get at. Okay,
right.
So he does order that, but they don't
actually
necessarily obey it to the full extent that it should be.
One, I'm not sure that they obey it to the fullest extent. I'm not sure they want to obey it. I'm not sure they're capable of obeying it, not because God's not with them, but because they end up not just being obedient. They end up not really trying to be obedient to God all that hard, right? They just don't. For lots of different reasons, they tend to not do that.
Well, it's God's judgment, and it's trying to get rid of the idolatry and just to save Israel, right?
Right. So you can see that if you look at what he says, that God is ultimately, if you read 7 and all of 8, you'll see he keeps saying over and over and over again. He says, and verse 9 too, or I mean chapter 9 too. If you see what he says, he keeps saying to them, like, so we look in verse 7, he says, the Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous, for you were the fewest of the people. He says that also, he says later on, that the reason why I'm doing this is because God is bringing judgment on these nations. And that is part of, so in Genesis chapter 15, there is this profound experience that Abraham has, right? He goes up and looks at the stars, and God says, you know, this is, your nation, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. He says, but I'm going to send you into, first, your descendants are going to go down into Egypt. They're going to be there for 400 years, and then I will bring them out. And he says specifically, for the sin of the Amorite, which is all of these people would be considered Amorites, the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its fullness. It's not yet, the idea is it's not full enough yet. And so what happens in those 400 years with God, I don't know. And the Bible doesn't even talk about it. But somehow God is waiting for the Amorites to eat. I don't know what's going on, but they're not they're not actually repenting or anything. And so this is his judgment, similarly to as the Israelites, when they disobey God, they are judged as well. And the same thing happens to them, right? A nation comes in and dispossesses them out of the land. And so you can see, so in some ways God plays favorites, but in some ways he doesn't, right? The Israelites get the same treatment, really, that the Amorites get, even though they are his treasured possession. But there's no easy way around. Most of us would like for God to have figured a different way to do this, right? Like most of us would go, if I'm really honest, I don't want God. I would prefer God not do this. But this isn't just most people will say, well, this is an Old Testament thing. But when you look in the New Testament, Jesus talks about the coming wrath of God. When he's talking about to the Pharisees, he says, who told you to fear the coming wrath of God, or to get out of the way of the coming wrath of God? Flee is the word he uses. And then in Revelation, God, there's this big battle at the end. How symbolic is the big battle? I don't know, but clearly there's some sort of cataclysmic event that where God judges the world for its sinfulness and makes it right. And so you can't just, what we would be tempted to do is to say, there's this sort of violence, but good thing it's only in the Old Testament. And so we can kind of get rid of that anyway, because let's face it, there's a lot of things the Old Testament says that we don't like. So it's a useful tool to just go, let's just push it all over here. But you really can't do it, because once you look into the New Testament, there's a great deal of that kind of language, even in the New Testament. And so I don't know that there's not easy answers, other than the fact that we sometimes just have to say God is God and we're not. But that's hard. There's still times when you read this and you go, oh man, this is, I just wish God, I think God could have come up with something better. But ultimately, I just trust God, I think, with that. You're muted.
It's trash day. The trash trucks keep going by. So, yeah, he could have helped change their hearts. God could have helped change their hearts over to him instead of the idols. And
right.
Yeah.
And honestly, you could say the same thing about Israel. Why didn't he help Israel? You know what I mean? Why does he have to punish Israel and send them into exile? Surely there could have been something. And once again, there's such a mystery about what we can look back on it and go, well, we see the trajectory. Yes, God brings judgment on the Amorites. He brings judgment on the Israelites, but all of that was like the trajectory was that all of the people of the earth would eventually be included into the people of God, right? So eventually all of those ites, right, would eventually would be then included into the people in Jesus, would be included in the people of God. As a matter of fact, you could even think that God's plan in the Old Testament, when in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, that God says, you are a kingdom of priests. And what do priests do? Priests go to God on behalf of other people. And so in some sense, Israel's call, their vocation was to go to God on behalf of the whole world, right? If they're a kingdom of priests, then, and they're, Jesus says, when he's talking to the Jewish people, he says, you were light to the world, you're salt to the earth, but you never fulfilled your call to be those things. You never were the kingdom of priests. And because you failed, and rather they could have ever done it, that opens up some deep theological questions about, God's plan and human agency and all that stuff. But once you see the trajectory, you can kind of go, yes, I see that, there is some movement of God, where it may look like he's sort of, we might even accuse him of racism. It's like he just loved Jewish people, but he didn't love anybody else. The idea that is, of course, that God's blessing was always for the world. And you see that trajectory when you look when you look at the whole story. But even the Old Testament itself, there's a scholar named Brent Strawn who has written some books. And he basically says that even the Old Testament itself is a little bit self-conscious about the violence, and that it very often limits where that violence shows up. And so the violence that we're talking about only occurs really in 2 books of the Bible. It's actually really one. Deuteronomy prepares them for it, and Joshua does it, but all of the violence is limited to Joshua. And there's violence in others where there's wars and things like that. But the idea of Israel going in, there's no more, once they get to the promised land in Jerusalem, once they get the promised land, they're not like the idea in the ancient world would have been, yes, and God has also promised us that piece of land over there, because remember, in the ancient Near East, there's only a very small amount of like farmable land in the ancient Near East, the Fertile Crescent that goes around. And every other nation in the world at the time would have said, we need that piece of land because our if we're going to have more food security, right, we need to get that piece of land. And so they were constantly fighting over the same land. Israel is not allowed to do that. Israel is not allowed to go, okay, you see that piece of land over there, that we can now, change God's laws so that it allows us to get that piece over there. They are limited to the pieces of land they can actually, now it's a big swath of land that they're promised, but there's not a sense in which they don't have the manifest destiny where it's like, yes, we also need to go to Babylon and take their stuff. Otherwise we won't have, what we need. They're not allowed to do that. And there is a sense in which the violence is compartmentalized, and they are never given, and they are given a very much like I wish we would do with government powers. When a government, like with our government, we say, okay, it's okay to tax us for schools right now, but in 5 years that tax goes away, right? It's a limited temporary power, right? But what happens with governments is you give them power and they never relinquish that power, right? Then 5 years later, they just add another power to themselves. The idea in the Old Testament is that doesn't happen. This limited section of violence is limited, and then they're not allowed to declare war whenever they feel like they can declare war. It is a very limited time. And so the idea, there isn't a prescription in the Old Testament for holy war like there is in the Quran, right? You can't declare holy war in the Bible, even though many people accuse the Bible of the Old Testament of having these holy wars. They're not holy wars. There is a prescribed set a time frame for this for the um, uh, for the holy war. I mean the Holy Land stuff. I'm looking for the word conquest, the conquest of the Holy Land. But once it's over, it's over. There's not a surviving mandate that says, and when you need more land or something happens, you can then continue with God's blessing. God really puts firm restrictions on when they can go to war. And there's really, there's a lot of laws about warfare. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, there's a big, there are laws governing what warfare looks like and who you can, conscript into service and all that kind of stuff. So I do want you to see that the Old Testament is very different than the nations around them, in the sense that there's not a blank check for taking land whenever you feel like you need it. There is a set limit to the conquest. And then when you get to when you get out of that, there is no more idea that we need to expand the land or we need to keep moving. The only thing David and Solomon do is they expand the land to the actual land that God promised them in the first place. And then that's it. And very often that happens not by destroying everyone, but rather by, like the Philistines and people like that, they're constantly battling with them. Believe it or not, the Philistines live in Gaza. And so the people of Israel have been fighting for Gaza for like ever, since there was, that's where the Philistines lived, is in Gaza. So there's been this constant, but the thing about it is that when the Bible says that David and Solomon expand the territory, they basically, they expand the territory to closer to the limits of what God actually said they could have in the first place. But there's not more than that after that. Sorry, that was a long rambly thing.
Does that include Gaza?
It would have included Gaza, but I'm not sure that during the time of David and Solomon, they ever fully controlled Gaza. The Philistines were always technologically superior, even though they were smaller in numbers. The Philistines there's several theories about who the Philistines are. They're actually called the Sea Peoples. They think that they're actually Greeks who migrated down from Greece and landed there. And the Greeks were already in the Iron Age so their weapons were superior to the Jewish weapons, which were still, even their metal weapons were bronze. And bronze, an iron sword will cut through a bronze shield, right? They were just, the Greeks were technologically superior, even though they were a much smaller people. So the Jews never actually, I don't think they ever fully, I'd have to go and look, but I don't think they ever fully controlled Gaza, and they never fully controlled all of the land that God promised them that they were going to get. It never really happened, for lots of different. One, because you look at the book of Judges, and the book of Judges is just an utter dismal failure. They not only were they not able to get the land, but they were fighting amongst themselves, and they were constantly disobeying God, and God was constantly sending people to help them, and then they were getting back in trouble. And it was, the book of Judges just shows that the people of Israel never fully lived for God. And even under David and Solomon, we often skip Saul, but even under David and Solomon, they were never what they were called to be. So,
thank you.
Sorry, look, Armine, it looked like you had a question.
Yeah, I was going to ask earlier when you asked what we thought about that verse. I was going to say something, but it's kind of uncomfortable and controversial. But I'm glad you went into the explanation, because it kind of answered. Because throughout history, we see people use verses like this to just go to places and just say, "Well, it's my right. It's in the Bible.
Right.
I can do whatever I want." So anyway, I'm glad you had that discussion.
But even Israel is not allowed to, they can't justify further wars based on these chapters. There is a prescribed time frame, and then once it's over, it is over. Now the question would be, because even though David and Solomon were relatively good leaders, they lived in particularly David and Solomon lived in times when the other major powers, Egypt and Babylon and Assyria, they were having periods of downtime. So in other words, the leaders of Egypt and the leaders of the bigger countries were fighting amongst themselves. They weren't as powerful, so there wasn't these big these big other powers to fight with them at the time. Now could have been because of God's providence, of course. But so they lived in a very peaceful time because they just weren't there. The two big superpowers weren't fighting each other at the time, because Israel was really never a place you actually wanted to be. It was a place that got you to the place you wanted to be. It would be, people are always offended by this analogy, but it would be like, you can think of Israel like Kansas. Nobody actually wants to live there, but you got to go through it to get where you're going to go. It's kind of like that. It's
a flyover state.
Yeah, exactly. In some ways, Israel is the original rollover state, because think about it. It's mostly rocky desert. It's not incredibly, it's not an incredibly farmable place. I always heard that I knew a Jewish friend. He's like, God put the Jews in the only place in the Middle East that doesn't have any oil, right? There's no it's really, it's the place on the way to another place. So the only reason why Israel ever really came on the grand scheme is because the Babylonians were either fighting with the Egyptians or vice versa, right? It never shows up because it's just such a small place. It was never of great political significance to the rest of the world, but it's of great religious significance to the rest of the world, right? That's its prime, contribution. But once again, you see that one of the things that the Bible doesn't do that other texts do, like the Quran and others, they give you a blank check and say, if you see bad stuff, you just can declare holy war on it. And in fact, the Old Testament is very clear. You cannot, without a clear mandate from God, you can't go to war, right? You can't just say, well, God has given us this sort of blank check. We can use it whenever we need to. The Old Testament is very clear about that there's limits placed on this kind of warfare. And it was for a specific time, for a specific place, for a specific purpose. And so there are a lot of people who will say, oh, the Old Testament says holy war is fine and you can just do it. And it really doesn't say that. It is very, specifically for the time frame that it's in, it regulates warfare more than any other ancient Near Eastern document by far. And even, more modern, because, the Quran wasn't written until 600 or 700 AD, 500 or 600 now. I don't know the exact dates anymore, but it's like 500 years, after Jesus. And it's very different in terms of what they can use, how they can declare holy war, how violence can be justified. The Old and New Testaments don't allow for that same. Yes, it does have what we might call holy war in it, but it's for a specified time, for a specified purpose. Anyway, we are out of time, and I got to go to a staff meeting. So I think on Wednesday, we're going to, now that we've talked about the holiness that's in Deuteronomy, we're going to look a little more closely at the 1 Peter passage that was also included in this week's sermon. And we're going to talk about sort of how holiness in the Old Testament is pulled over into the New Testament. And if you read 1 Peter, it's not a very long book. We talked on Sunday, we just used the 1 Peter, I think it's like 13 through the first part of the second chapter of 1 Peter. But then after that, the 1 Peter talks then about becoming a holy temple to the Lord, about how we become a holy temple. And if you think about how holiness works, then you get to, you know, it begins to make sense when you think about God's presence in the world, and his presence is primarily symbolized by the temple and how holy the temple was and how, you know, the restrictions. Then for Peter to pick up in the New Testament, to pick up the idea that we become the holy temple. Well, then what must we keep out of God's presence in our lives, right? So if the temple has to be, you know, guarded so that unholy things don't get in there, if we're now the holy temple of God, what would that mean for us? You know, how would we, what's our purpose, and then how would we live if that were the case? And so you can see how Peter in fact quotes from Leviticus several times, and you know, and thinking about what does it mean to be holy. So that's what we'll do on Wednesday, and Friday we'll I haven't quite, I wanted to see how these two went before we decided what we would do on Friday. So anyway, thank you guys so much. And since I recorded this now, I'm going to find it and figure out how to put it up. So I know that there were some people that were watching, and so it'll be up somewhere. So if you see it, you know, share it or something so that other people can find it, because it might be a little bit difficult when we first start for people to see it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Good to see you,
Thanks a
Mary.
lot.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.